Thus far, we have taken a look at getting all our input from the keyboard and displaying all our output onto the screen of your computer. Most of you may be thinking this is probably the only way to read data and store data or display data. But in real life, you will be using something called as files extensively. So before we come to files, let us try to understand a little of the background information. The first thing is, when you're working in a company, or let's say you're working in a university, for example, when I enter the university, all my data is accepted from me and it is already stored permanently on the hard disk. So I can use the same data to generate my marks card because it has my registration number, name, address, and everything. So the moral of the story here is I am not going to enter data every time from the keyboard and see everything on the screen. Because for example, when you're printing your marks card output is not going to be displayed on a screen. It's going to be printed on the piece of paper or a piece of legal paper. So what happens in real life is most of the data is already captured for some other purpose and we tend to reuse it. Now the data which is captured for some other purpose is already stored in a place called as a file. So file is a series of ones and zeros which exists permanently on your hard disk. Now, when we're entering data on the screen, we don't enter really much of data because you maybe enter 5, 10, and then you will not really go ahead trying to enter data. The data on the hard disk is really humongous. Think of all the data of all the students of your university residing on the hard disk. That data is going to be really huge. Nobody is going to enter that data from the keyboard and watch it on the screen again and again. So the volume of data in the files or on the hard disk is really humongous. Files is not really a new concept. We have written our C program and saved it with the name .c. That is an example of a file. You may want to write a letter to apply for leave to your class teacher. So that can be called a letter.doc if you're writing it in Word. That is another example of a file. So file is not something really new. Now the advantage of storing data in a file is it can be stored for a very long time or almost ever. That's why we say data in a file is persistent. Persistent in the sense the minute you switch off the computer power, it does not go off. Right now what we were doing is we were entering data in the keyboard. The minute you shut down your machine, you really didn't have any data. All the data was lost. But that's not how real life really works. Now, I had already told you files is not a new concept because we have already saved our data or programs in .c files. You have written a letter asking for a leave in a Word document. So there's all examples of file. The advantage of files is when you type onto the screen, I can't pass it on to somebody else. But in files, the data can be copied from one machine to other, from one person to other, and so on. Now, the way files are stored or processed are there are two major ways. One is files are stored sequentially and read sequentially, as in case of a magnetic tape. But if you are accessing data from a DVD, data is stored in different tracks, so you can straight away go to that particular track and get the required data. Whereas with the tape, you have to go till that particular point in a sequence and then get it. So the files may be sequentially accessed or they may be accessed randomly. Now, in order to understand processing from data from a file, you must first understand that the data in a file which exists on your hard disk must be opened and loaded into your main memory. All the processing by your CPU happens only if the data is in main memory. It can't process data directly from the hard disk. So that is the first step. So data always must come into the main memory before it can be used, processed, or reused. Now, suppose I want to create a file for you. Let's say I'm running a very small institute of 100 students. I want to maintain the details of every student in a file. So I will buy 100 simple files. So when a new student comes, I'll open a file. I'll take a piece of paper. I'll write something about you in that particular piece of paper, put it into the file, and then I'll close the file and I'll keep it for record. Next time, if I want some information from you, I'll take the file again from the drawer. I'll open the file. I'll read that from the file. I'll close the file and I'll put it back onto the drawer. Similarly, when we are using files from the hard disk, the process to use a file is almost on the similar lines. So let's understand what are the processing steps. So before I talk about the way you process a file, in C you need to think of files as simply a series or sequence of characters or bytes. Okay, so you're basically going to read one character at a time. Although you don't get that feel that it is reading one character, but C tends to read one character at a time and presents it to you so that you can process. Now, as I told you, what are the normal operations on a file? First thing is you need to create a file. Suppose you want to write a Word document. First time you will say file new because you're creating a file. Next time, if you suppose you want to now use that in future, you will open that file. All right, and then if you want to read it, you can read a file, you can write to that Word document, or you can close that particular file when all your work is done. So let me just summarize what are the normal operations on file. Similar to a file we use in our day-to-day life, we create a new file or create a file for the first time when we are going to use it, that is create. If the file already exists, we simply open the file. When we open the file, we may read into that file or we may write onto that file. When all our processing is done with the file, all that we do is we say close the file. Just as we do manually, even in the computers, we are required to close a file. So the purpose of this particular session was to just give you an idea about why do we need files? What are files all about? What are the basic steps in working with files? And what are the advantages of files? Because in real life, you're going to work with files a lot. So it's really important to have a good conceptual understanding of files. Files are nothing difficult or different. You just need to practice a lot of programs, because students generally don't tend to give a lot of importance to files, but files in real life are going to be used extensively, because all data in real life is almost certainly going to be on your hard disk or on your secondary memory.